Welcome back. Honestly, this one is a video a long time in the making and something I'm really excited for. It's probably been almost 6 to 9 months now I've been kind of brainstorming this. And the reason why is I really wanted to make sure I really think through all the aspects of how to present this properly. And so what is the topic? You've read the title. It's defining what is good technique. The fact is, if you ask 10 different coaches, you're probably going to get 10 different answers on what good technique is, as well as some of them saying there's no such thing as good technique. But inherently, I think most people can agree that there is something that we can consider bad technique, as well as the fact that we consider aspects of improving technique. So if that's the case, there has to be a spectrum of what is better and worse to an extent. And so what I really hope to do in this video is define what that is. And to start getting into it, first, it's actually pretty basic, and I don't think what I'm going to say is incredibly revolutionary. What I think the issue tends to lie and why this argument starts to occur is people speak in too much absolutes. And when we speak in absolutes, we then see people like Amanda Lawrence, Sean Noriega, Leah Beauvoir, I could name numerous others who are doing things that are against what we consider the norm, being incredibly successful, incredibly strong. So then we say, okay, well, we can't say there's absolute good technique because look at them. They're doing what is against what someone might be saying is good technique. And a major thing people fail to realize is we can't see a lot of what makes up our actual anthropometry and leverages. A lot of it is below the skin. Obviously, we can see like arm lengths and leg lengths and torso lengths and all these things in general body structure, but there's a lot underneath the skin that we can't tell. If we had an x-ray and we could x-ray every lifter ever, we could probably formulate some type of system here, but there's differences in joints and how they're made up, and all these different aspects of kind of what entails a lifter's general ability to be able to perform movements and how they're going to do it that's going to best leverage their anthropometry. So while what I'm going to say I don't think is revolutionary, I think more so this would be a new way to approach and frame how we coach and go about looking at technique. Because in theory, if the 3 factors I'm going to mention are met, there could be a lot of different ways to come to the same result. And that's where we can see different coaches and different lifters doing fairly different strategies, yet all being correct in sense. And each coach and lifter can maintain their bias of what they think is correct because their system is the way they found to best achieve the results they're looking for within the 3 constraints I'm going to mention. And any technical intervention a coach or lifter would implement would be to directly improve one of these 3 factors. So what are the 3 factors? Number 1, it must fit within powerlifting rules. Now, caveat, what I am talking about is good technique within powerlifting. So that doesn't apply to everyone anywhere in regards to fitness. This is specifically for powerlifting, but it needs to fit within powerlifting rules. Number 2, you need to maintain and manage your center of mass. And then third, good technique should work to reduce work output and increase force output. And as mentioned, some people might hear that right off the bat and be like, I don't know if this could describe good technique. But again, there's a spectrum here. So looking at each, if it must fit within powerlifting rules, inherently, I think most people would say, if you literally cannot perform a lift to competition standard, it's not good technique, it's bad technique. So therefore, there must be the opposite end of the spectrum that there is good technique, aka that it fits and you can perform to a competition standard. Number 2 being maintain your center of mass. Now, I'm talking to an extreme here in some aspects, but if you were literally falling over and you're falling off the bench or you're falling on your squat or you're rocking back on your deadlift and always losing your balance on every single lift, that would be bad technique. Probably the most basic element of what we're doing in powerlifting is fighting against gravitational forces and trying to remain as stable and centered within that as possible. And then with the third point of trying to reduce work output and increase force output, the goal of powerlifting is to lift the most weight possible. Now, I'm not a physics major. If you watch my video on distance traveled and some other ones, I talk about the actual calculation of work. And since most coaches are not physics majors, they're not going to actually do a work output or a work output calculation. What we kind of tend to bias towards as the word for that is efficiency, which can somewhat be defined as just basically eliminating unneeded movement. We want to be as efficient as possible so that the majority of what we're doing is going towards lifting the most weight possible. And this point many times goes back to the center of mass aspect. And we're going to get to that later in the video. But like Example of this is trying to reduce work output and increase force output is you wouldn't put the bar on deadlift 2 feet away from you and try and lift it. There inherently is going to increase your work output due to that, because it's increasing the horizontal movement that really isn't needed. It's a vertical movement, as well as it's decreasing your force output because you're not fighting against just gravity alone. You're fighting against your center of mass. So again, we're going to get into a lot of this. There's a big range here, and we're going to talk about that as well. But these are the 3 main factors I look at of what we describe as good technique. So taking those 3 factors, what I think we run into issues of people arguing over what is good technique is because we come from a top-down approach versus a bottom-up approach. If we were to take 10 different coaches in 10 different kind of realms of what they teach, I would bet almost everything we do leads back to improving those 3 main factors, which I'm going to show throughout this video. So even if we disagree, we still are trying to come to the same result. An example being, like, some coaches like to coach knees out and really sit back. If you've watched my videos, I think a little bit more about driving the knees forward and letting the chest lean. That was my cue I used in my squat video. Coaches could disagree on what's right and wrong, but as long as it leads back to these 3 main factors, we can still quantify it as good technique. Because coaches will always bias towards the cues and techniques that they think work best within their system. What is wrong is saying that it's a one-size-fits-all, that every single person needs to move the same way, every single person uses the same cues, and you basically just have this this factory of lifters who all look the exact same, do the exact same thing, and if they don't do it that way, they're wrong. That's the top-down approach. That's where you're saying they have to do X, Y, and Z or else it's wrong, versus bottoms-up is, are they satisfying powerlifting rules? Are they maintaining their center of mass? And are they doing to the best of their ability to decrease work output and increase force output? And just some examples of a top-down approach is everyone should have a neutral pelvis, everyone should have a straight back, etc., etc. Things like that. Not correct. I think most people watching this video would agree with that. But where I don't think we have a good system is understanding how to put this into a framework that helps for all different spectrums to be able to coach technique and understand what is good technique. And that is the hope of this video, is to create that framework. And to throw one thing in there, a 4th factor could be, does it cause pain? But I want this video to be as objective as possible. I would say, does it cause pain can be a bit subjective and could be a video all on its own of different opinions there, because there's definitely people that disagree that technique has no correlation to pain. There's some that have a little bit different reasoning there of how it could lead to pain. I don't want to get into that. It could be one, but for the sake of trying to be as objective as possible and not create this framework that could have, in a sense, I really think, argument against it, we're going to leave that point out. So with that being said, obviously I have my biases. And if you're watching my YouTube channel, there's a good chance you've watched my other videos and you have a general idea of how I cue things. Again, within my system, that is how I best find to be able to satisfy these 3 factors. And throughout this video, I'm going to use examples from that. It doesn't mean that's good technique. What I'm trying to do is allow you to understand my thinking in the bottoms-up method of how I'm going to coach technique within my system to satisfy powerlifting rules, to help people maintain their center of mass, and help to decrease work output and increase force output. And then lastly, as I've kind of alluded to within these 3 factors, there is a range. There's a big range. Inherently bad technique means you legitimately cannot satisfy one or more of those elements. Like I said, you're literally falling back every time you lift. You literally cannot hit depth no matter what you do on squat. There's inherently bad technique, but it's a huge range. And that's where it can be a little bit more subjective. But to hopefully help within that, my coach, I'll call him the coach of coaches, Brad Couillard, who's very well known within the industry, especially among coaches in particular, about being what we'll call a movement guru in a sense. He's going to kind of dive into the range aspect and really kind of give an understanding of how we can hopefully quantify and describe what the range is of what good technique is versus where it might be a tipping point of actually we quantify it as bad technique. And within that range too, and something you'll see me touch on plenty within this video, we can have good technique and want to still improve it, because there's a range of what is good technique. There's things that we can see that if, it's good, but we see a possibility to improve to make things even more consistent or better. But without further ado, because everyone knows I probably could ramble about the introduction forever, let's get straight into things, starting with it must fit within powerlifting rules. So simply put, there are rules in powerlifting that we must follow, and if we cannot follow those rules, that's an issue. Now, there is a range to that. There's situations where legitimately someone cannot perform a lift to competition standard by any means. And then there's some that, like, maybe your third attempt, you have a little bit of an issue. There's a difference there. That's where, again, we talk about a range. If you can't, for sake of this video and what we're talking about, if you cannot perform a lift at any weight to competition standard, that would be classified as bad technique. And just like with all these factors, there's a range to this, where some people legitimately at any weight may not be able to perform it to competition standard. And there's some where maybe just towards like the top end range, they're struggling with that. So there's a difference in understanding of what is good versus bad there in the spectrum, which again, we're going to get to later on in the video. And so with either of those examples, we have technique interventions that a coach or a lifter may use to be able to improve upon those. Either one, from getting yourself from not being able to perform at all at a competition standard to being at a competition standard, versus two, maybe you already have fairly good technique, but come third attempt time, you're struggling with some certain technical issue, and there's something you could do to slightly improve that, to in a sense have better technique that would create a more consistent lift and likely a better chance at getting 3 white lights. So what we'll do is I'm first going to point out some of the rules for squat, bench, and deadlift, specifically the technical ones that we might be making some type of changes to improve upon that. And there are more rules than what I'll mention, but these are going to be the technique-based ones. And then second, I'm going to get into examples of possible cueing I might use to be able to help improve or fix these issues. But again, they're going to be examples of what I would do to more so give a framework of how I approach this from a bottoms-up view versus saying this is exactly what you have to do, which would be a top-down approach. So for squat, there's 3 main technical rules that we need to abide by, and there's no ifs, ands, or buts. We have to do these to be able to compete in powerlifting and be successful. The first and likely most common one that everyone talks about is squat depth. We have to be able to get the hip crease below the knee joint. If we cannot do that in any manner, I would consider that bad technique. More likely, people might have inconsistencies or some slight little things they do that makes it a bit harder to reach depth, but they can do it. But to give an idea of what like literally cannot do it is, if I was to go in a super wide stance, that's as deep as I can go. I literally cannot hit depth because of that technique. My anthropometry, what my hips do, all that kind of stuff, does not allow me to hit depth. We'll get into some other options of when we get into kind of the examples of like what we might do of like if we're inconsistent with hitting depth, what might be some technical interventions you see a coach use and why they're going to be using them to help make depth more consistent. The second one is we have to start with our knees locked. As we go to the squat, we then have to lock them at the top. No ifs, ands, or buts. To be able to get the start command, they have to start locked. To get the rack command, they have to end locked, or to get at least white lights with that rack command. And then the last one is after we get the start command, we can no longer shift our feet. Now, you can't see my feet, but you can rock back a little back and forth on them. That's not against the rules. What you can't do is you can't move your feet out, you can't move your foot forward, aka usually that's from losing balance, which we're gonna get to a lot in the center of mass discussion as well. So for the bench press, there's 3 main technical rules we have to abide by. The first one being our butt must maintain contact with the bench. In some federations, also our head. More USAPL and IPF federations require that. But what that means is as we bench press, our butt cannot fly up off the bench or maintain off the bench throughout the entirety of the movement. And the same thing at certain federations. We can't have our head come up off the bench and then come back down. The second one, and you won't be able to fully see it, is our feet have to remain in contact with the floor. And then in some federations, we have to have our feet flat. So it depends on if the foot flat, meaning the heel has to be down too, or we can just be on our toes. But either way, we cannot let our foot rise up off the floor. We can allow them to slide, but they have to maintain contact. And then especially, it's more so of an issue in USAPL and IPF federations, where yes, our feet remain in contact, but we start seeing that heel kind of come up a little bit or something happen there where we lose a little bit of contact. And then the third one is our elbows must start locked and end locked. So as we're going through the bench press, we're gonna have to start with our elbows locked. We're going to have to come down, press, lock them again to get that start and rack command. And then a fourth one I'm actually gonna add, but it's extremely uncommon. You rarely see it called, is a heave, meaning you cannot allow the bar to come down, pause, then resync again after the pause to then press it up. So after the pause, the first thing has to do, the first motion of the bar has to be up. It cannot sink further and then come back up. And then lastly, we have deadlift, which I have 3 technical rules as well to go over. The first one, kind of is encompassing through multiple aspects, is as we come to lockout, we must lock out the hips, the shoulders must be locked back, and the knees must be locked as well. So 3 points of lockout that we must occur. We can't have soft knees, we can't have soft hips, and the shoulders can't be soft and rounded over. Next, we must maintain grip of the bar. We can lift it up, and then we get the down command. We must be able to follow the bar down. We can't just drop it from this point, or as we're going down, lose grip, and then drop it halfway down. We have to be able to maintain grip of the bar throughout the entirety of the motion. And then lastly, we cannot ramp or hitch. Ramping, meaning we drive as we're coming up, we drive those knees forward, and then we slide the bar up our thighs. Hitch means once we get to mid-thighs, we kind of bounce it up to kind of inch our way up into the movement. Now, for all of these, there's other things like up and down and some other stuff, but I'm not gonna get into those because they're not as much of technical rules, they're more execution-based stuff. I want to more cover the technical stuff. And all those are pretty obvious. Again, I don't think I'm saying anything revolutionary. I hope everyone watching this video knows those rules. What I want you to take from this is what we're gonna look at now, which is, okay, a lifter either 1, cannot perform to one of those standards in any regard, or 2, they have good technique, but maybe we could improve upon that by allowing them to be more consistent with being able to perform the competition standard. So as I go through these lifts, I'm not gonna go through every single example of what I might do. I more so want to just give a baseline of the understanding and framework of, okay, from bottoms up, we have this issue. Now we're gonna introduce a technical intervention to help with that issue. And as mentioned, some people may have absolutely nothing to work on in this area, which therefore would suffice that maybe we don't need to think about technical interventions for this lifter because they're able to do all these things to a competition standard. So at least in this factor, their technique is very sound and does not need constant cueing and change to improve per se, at least in this element. And with some of the things I say, there might be coaches that disagree with what I'm going to recommend, but that's not the point. I'm completely okay with you disagreeing. It's understanding how I'm approaching technique more so than what I'm saying to do on technique. I am looking at, again, from a bottoms-up approach that a lifter can't do this, so I, in my system, find the best way to accomplish improving and or fixing that is to do this. So, starting with a squat, what happens if someone cannot hit depth? 2 possible options, out of many, but 2 possible options. 1, it could relate to anterior pelvic tilt. And again, this is where like some people say, oh, you should never anteriorly rotate your pelvis. It's not what I'm saying at all. I am saying from a bottoms-up approach, if depth is an issue, we could look at an anterior pelvic tilt as a solution. So, why is that? Because when you anteriorly rotate your pelvis, you lose room for that femur to move in that front of the hip and hip flexion range. Versus if we posteriorly rotate, I'm overly doing it, we gain a lot more room. So if someone's anteriorly tilted and they're going down, they're always cutting depth right about here, you can see them a little bit high. But if that person was to have a little bit more maybe neutral pelvic orientation, all of a sudden, they now feel like they can go deeper. That would be a possible solution and a bottoms-up approach to looking at how can I fix their depth. Another option would be some people might have a little bit of an issue with how much they're kind of dominant with their knee flexion versus hip flexion. If you are way too knee flexion based and trying to stay way too upright, I can go super deep, you can't really fully see it here, and I'm still not at depth versus all I do is allow myself to maintain my center of mass more and have a little more hip flexion, and all of a sudden that hip creases below the knee. Again, some people might drive the knees forward a ton and stay pretty upright and they suffice and there's no issue at all, but others, we may look at them and say, okay, to be able to squat to depth, we need to adjust this aspect of their technique. If we're looking at locking the knees at the start and the end, a lot of times for that one, that is more just actively cueing. It tends to be a little bit of a bad habit, but going the opposite. I said anterior pelvic tilt could limit depth. Posterior pelvic tilt tends to want to unlock the knees. That tends to be a little bit of an issue. If we overly posteriorly tilt, we tend to want to engage the hamstrings more, and that pushes the knee forward and makes it fairly hard to lock. So just like anterior tilt could possibly be a bottoms-up solution for fixing depth, posterior tilt could be a possible solution to get more neutral because we're having issues locking our knees or starting with our knees locked in the first place. And then the last one being that someone continually has issues with stepping forward or losing balance or shifting in their squat. That tends to be a center of mass issue. That's one we're going to cover obviously in a lot of details, and that's going to be factor number 2. But it could be as simple as helping them to get better connection with their foot rooting, which I have a whole video on that, and I'll link that below if you actually want to get into it. But I'm not really going to get into how to foot root, to root your feet. More so, that is a possible solution for helping someone be able to understand how to maintain their center of mass and center of gravity better and not have as much of an issue with stepping back or stepping forward. So moving on the bench, our first thing we're going to look at is someone whose butt continually keeps coming off the bench. Something that might help for someone struggling with that is a better understanding of leg drive. A big reason a lot of times the butt wants to come up is because we let go of tension, we get a little leg drive, and then we all of a sudden push, and it pops us off the bench. I've got a whole video on that again. So again, I'm not trying to go into the actual technique aspect, more the understanding of we see an issue and then we have something that solves it, not everyone should leg drive the same, even if it's not an issue in the first place. So another thing could be with that is could be foot placement, especially when it comes to different federations. If you need to have your full foot flat or it can be on your toes, different foot placement could be a solution for keeping the butt down. Just all depends on the lifter and if they have that issue in the first place. The next technical issue, possibly with bench press, is people whose feet are coming up off the floor, which again is more likely to happen in the IPF and USAPL federations where you need to maintain the foot completely flat. Most people don't actually lift their foot up off the floor in the sense of like in other federations where you just have to keep some contact, just like the toes. It's more so in the federations that have to be flat that people will start to have some part of their foot rising up. And that comes a lot back to foot placement and finding the optimal placement to be able to keep it flat. Because a lot of times that comes from just people wanting to tuck too far under. Now, other federations, tucking too far under isn't necessarily as much of an issue because as long as your feet are touching, you're good. And then lastly, if someone's struggling with keeping their getting their elbows to start locked out or finish locked out, one, kind of like squat, that could be just an active cueing where they need to pay more attention to it. Or two, another video I have is all about how sometimes people want to tend to over-retract, and that's going to unlock the elbows and make it very hard to lock them out due to the tricep insertion to the scapula. So there might be a reason I might bring that up to someone and kind of cue them differently because we need to get them in a position where they're going to be getting that start command and getting that rack command. And then lastly for bench press, I did mention a fourth possible reason, which is a heave, which is less common, but that usually comes down to leg drive as well, at least with how it works within my system. If someone's having an issue with heaving and resyncing, usually if they're letting it resync, they're letting off tension, they're letting off that kind of that rib cage expansion and letting off leg drive to allow it to sink again. So it's just something I'm simply going to cue to be able to maintain leg drive better and maintain kind of that thoracic extension a bit better. And then lastly, we have deadlift. So going through the examples there, the first technical issue we talked about was the hips, knees, or shoulders not being fully locked at the top. Now, there could be a multitude of reasons for this one. Again, it's not so much about what are the reasons, it's about thinking that that is the issue. Now, what within our system do we feel like can help correct that? So there could be a lot of different reasons, but if you watch some of my YouTube videos on deadlifting, in particular, when it comes to lockout of the knees and the hips, I've talked a lot about how these are my principles that comes down to a lot of the starting position. If we tend to overly posteriorly rotate and tuck our pelvis, when we get to the top, we've already extended our hips and our we've already kind of fully contracted our glutes and our hamstrings. It's just kind of this uncurling motion with the back extensors. So we could possibly improve our starting position, and that's going to help create a better lockout for someone. The next is we must maintain grip of the bar. Now, it could just be a bad habit where someone's just been dropping the bar at the top, but more likely we're talking about grip strength, where someone's getting the lockout, they can't hold at the top. So we're looking at implementing some type of grip strength stuff to be able to improve grip strength so they can be within the technical rules of the deadlift. And then lastly, we have the issue of ramping or hitching, which could come back to the exact same thing I talked about in regards to lockout, which comes to the overly posteriorly rotated pelvis. I've also found it can be because of over-biasing towards the heels and not getting the quads actively engaged enough. This one is a really good example to me of one, though, that can have a very, very broad spectrum. You're going to see some people that you won't see this present at all until like a third attempt max deadlift. And you'll also have some people that you're going to see it all the way from the first attempt and you're already worried that they're going to fail because they might be hitching or ramping due to their just natural starting position, even at lower weights. And that's where, again, I'm talking about there's a spectrum. We have a spectrum to good technique and a spectrum towards bad technique. Bad inherently would entail that you legitimately, at pretty much any weight, or at least at the point of what we need to compete in powerlifting the weight, could not perform these lifts to the standards that we talked about. versus there are going to be plenty of examples where people can do this to a decent standard, be considered good technique, but we're going to see it more near maximal weights that they're going to struggle with a couple of these factors here and there, whether it may be ramping or hitching or depth on squat or whatever it may be. We may only see that present towards the end. It doesn't mean just because at the maximal weight they do that, they have bad technique. It just means that we possibly could have room for improvement there. And if we do see that issue, we then use technical interventions to help, again, I'm going to repeat it over and over, in a bottoms-up approach to fix that issue, not just cue someone because we think every single person should lift like that. So wrapping up factor one, being able to abide by powerlifting rules, arguably that's the most important. And that's what I know Brad is going to really discuss when it comes to the ranges. The single most important thing is we fit within powerlifting rules. The next two factors are kind of a little bit steps away from that, but are really foundational aspects of what we're trying to do and what we have to do within powerlifting. And so the next factor is maintaining your center of mass. And at the base level, when we are squatting, benching, and deadlifting, we are fighting against gravity, trying to remain stable and keeping our center of mass over our center of gravity. That's the element of exactly what we're doing at its most base level. And the more we can manage our center of mass, in sense, the less work we can do if we can get back to the physics and actually do calculations, because the less displacement and movement we have from our initial vectors, which is more our center of gravity. And while there is definitely a range to your center of mass and center of gravity and maintaining that, because like I said, the extreme end is like literally we fall, but not everyone is perfectly maintaining it either. It's a matter of the range is at what point does it start to negatively impact our ability to do what we'll talk about next, which is increasing our force output and displaying maximal strength. And so outside of abiding by powerlifting rules, there's nothing more important than maintaining your center of mass and center of gravity through all three competition movements. And whether you realize it or not, almost all the technical cues and foundations of technique and biomechanics that range from all different coaches pretty much all come back together to help someone maintain their center of mass as best as possible within powerlifting rules. So just like we did with the powerlifting rules, let's follow the same exact format. First, we're going to go through the description of what is maintaining your center of mass in relation to the squat, bench, and deadlift, and then going through some possible technical interventions that a coach might, in a bottoms-up format, implement to help with those if it's a significant issue, or even if it is, in a sense, good technique where we feel like there could possibly be some improvement. So when it comes to the squat, our direct connection with where we are exerting force is to the floor. Even though the bar's on our back and we're exerting force up into it, we can't do that unless we have equal and opposite reaction of the feet driving through the floor to create that propulsion up. So our foot to the floor is the main connection of where we are managing, or at least determining, where that center of mass is. And so, again, if that's something you want more information on, in my foot rooting video, I've definitely talked about this a little bit further, but we want to maintain the center of gravity and our center of mass over our midfoot, which our midfoot tends to be right in front of our heel. Our toes are more stabilizers. We want to look more at the ball of our toes to our heel, and that midfoot area is somewhere right in front of that heel, or you could say right in front of that tibia. That's where we're trying to maintain it. And if you're looking at the squat, it's pretty much a direct vertical movement. So when you are lined up, that bar is going to be directly over that midfoot, and it's trying to translate its path directly over, going down, and directly over, coming up. Now within that, our body is moving however it needs to be able to accomplish that. But as mentioned, we're going to have deviation. You're going to see some people with a slightly forward bar path. You're going to see a lot of different things. It doesn't necessarily mean it's bad technique and it's wrong, as long as it fits in possibly within this range of what is acceptable and is not having a negative impact. But our goal at the base level should be as best as possible to maintain our center of mass over our midfoot on the squat. For bench, that's a little bit more complicated because there's two different elements of our center of mass. Number one is our body in relation to the actual bench pad. And then the second is the bar in relation to our body. I'll start with the body in relation to the bench pad. We don't really need to talk about that too much because that basically means just don't fall off the bench. You don't really see that too often. I mean, barring someone's really offset on the bench and it's creating issues and they're literally wanting to fall off, then maybe it's something you're needing to take a look at. But for the most part, most people don't have an issue being on the bench and being stable on the bench, especially in powerlifting where we have wider benches and more stable benches. The more important aspect of maintaining your center mass on the bench press is maintaining the bar's relation to your body. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to keep the bar in between your elbow or your shoulder and your elbow and wrist joint. It's a little more complicated because now we're looking at multiple points. So let me describe what that means. So as we bench press, we are going to be starting with that bar directly over our shoulders. That's where it's very stable. Gravity's going directly down. There is only a vertical force. If we're back here, that bar's wanting to lose balance going back. If we're here, you can see it's in front of my elbow and in front of my shoulder. I'm wanting to go this way. So I start directly over my shoulder. But as I descend, it's going to move from my shoulder to more over my chest. And the way we maintain our center of mass is the elbow stays under the bar or slightly in front. If I move my elbows out or behind it, the bar's gonna wanna dump away from me. So I need to make sure that that bar in some manner stays in between the elbow and wrist and that shoulder joint at all times. And then as I press back up, the bar moves back over my shoulders, maintains that direct vertical gravity force over the shoulders, and then I can rack. So that's what we mean by maintaining your center of mass and gravity on the bench press. And then lastly, we have deadlift, which is very similar to squat. We want to maintain our balance and our center of mass over our midfoot. That doesn't change. The difference though between deadlift and squat is squat, that bar sits directly over our body, and there's only a horizontal pull in regards to that in a sense. With the deadlift, that bar is always going to be in front of our body in some manner. So even though the actual center of gravity is over our midfoot, the bar possibly might be slightly in front of our midfoot and our body is counterbalancing back behind our midfoot. That's why a lot of times you're going to see people actually leaning backwards to an extent at lockout to the fact they're having to counterbalance the bar being in front of them. All right, so now that we understand what our center of mass and center of gravity is for the squat, bench, and deadlift, just like we did for the powerlifting rules, we're going to take a look at examples. And again, I'm going to put in the caveat that we have a spectrum. There are some people that just inherently cannot maintain their balance, and we consider that bad technique. We have some people who do maintain their balance and their center of mass, but we could possibly see improvement of that. We would consider both good technique, but we could make it even better per se by improving our ability to maintain our balance and our stability throughout the entirety of the movement. And what we're gonna look at, again, is some things that I might implement from a bottoms-up approach to help work on these issues, but it doesn't mean that is all the things I could possibly do or all the options any coach might do. Again, you're trying to look at here is the issue, and then I'm going to implement some type of technical intervention to fix that, not you have to do this regardless if you have a center of mass issue or not. So starting with squat, we're going to look at 3 possible things I might do depending on the situation. But again, remember, there could be a lot more than this because the vast majority of what we cue technically and try to improve is all about maintaining our center of mass. Whether you realize it or not, that's a lot of what it comes down to. So the first one I already mentioned in the last section. If we are having issues with stability and we're losing forward or backward balance, a lot of times where I'm going to start is teaching someone how to root their feet, or if you don't like that term, just have a better connection with foot control and how to be able to feel their actual center of mass over their midfoot. The next one, that gets a bit more complex, and again, this is where it comes back to, like, it's not right or wrong, but we might have issues maintaining our center of mass due to how we align our rib cage and our pelvis. There are plenty of people who have a more flared rib cage and anteriorly rotated pelvis who have zero issue, not necessarily needing to fix anything. They still have good technique. It is only in sense an issue if it creates a problem within the 3 factors, and then the one we're discussing is center of mass. So how could it create a center of mass issue? So you might not be able to see it fully. I'm trying to get a decent view here. I'll step back a little bit, but if you're fairly anteriorly rotated, either one, as you go down, you may end up cutting depth. I already talked about that. But if you try to get depth and go further, but you've ran out of room for that femur to move within the front of the hip, your pelvis is going to have to start posteriorly rotating and returning to more neutral position. And what happens when we do that is as it does that, you can see it's shoving my knees forward and my center of mass forward. So we're losing our ability to maintain our center of mass over our midfoot due to that. So if someone continually has an issue where I'm saying that because of a highly anteriorly rotated pelvis, when they get to the bottom, they're posteriorly rotating and it shoves their center of mass forward, it gets them more onto their toes, and that's creating an issue. That's where I might have a technical intervention where I'm going to have them work on creating a more neutral pelvic orientation so we can maintain that center of mass better. And or the rib cage. It might be something not even related to the hips. It might be because they're thinking way too much chest up. And because of that, it's holding them into that anteriorly rotated position. And we fix from the rib cage down and see the benefits that as the rib cage starts to lean and we allow that hinge, they can hit depth and they can maintain their center of mass better. And the last example I'll give with squat and maintaining center mass is also something I talked about in regards to powerlifting rules, is our need to hip flexion as we go down and kind of the cadence of that, in particular when we start. So I'm going to use extreme examples. If all I do is cue hips back, I'm going to tend to want to bias back, barring I manage my midfoot. And then at this point, if I'm all the way back here and then I shove my knees forward, the momentum is going to tend to over carry me forward because I over bias backwards. And then as I try to shift forward and stop at my center of mass, I'm not going to do that. It's going to shift me past and forward of it. And the opposite is true too. If you drive your knees forward too far, at a certain point, oh, I can't really go any further, it then shoves my center of mass back, and you can see as I kind of get to that bottom, I'm having that momentum carry me back, and I'm likely not going to stop over my center of gravity. It's going to carry me too far back. So that's where it would be important, where I might work with a lifter to find a bit more balance, especially in that starting position, in that first half of the movement, in finding the ability to hinge through hip flexion and go through knee flexion at a rate that allows them to maintain their center of mass throughout the movement. That goes back to, again, not wrong for your hips to go back, not wrong for your knees to go forward. What we're trying to do, though, is find the right degree of both to be able to maintain your center of mass. And it may be different per lifter, and it may be different per coach on how they teach that. All right, next up, we have bench press. And like I said, bench press is a little bit more complicated because we're looking at multiple factors of where our center of mass is balancing. And it's changing throughout the movement because unlike squat and deadlift, it has a bit more of a horizontal vector we are working through, not just direct vertical force. So also just like squat, I'm going to give 3 examples of possible solutions and interventions I might use depending on the situation with one of my lifters to help them maintain their center of mass more. So first would be just general positioning of leg drive, arch, and having that kind of thoracic extension and chest up position. Because one reason some people can't maintain their center of mass is because they only have so much shoulder range of motion. I got really long arms. If I do a really close grip and I go flat back, that right there is my range of motion before I have to give somewhere else. I can either 1, extend, or 2, I dump my shoulder forward and see what happens there. I lose my center of mass. So you can see that in relation to the actual bar coming down. If I'm super flat back and super close grip, for me to get all the way down, I lose my center of mass and it dumps forward on me. Instead, either 1, I can do a little wider grip, or 2, I can be able to arch, reduce that range of motion, and be able to better maintain my center of mass, as well as something I did there. It's something it could be discussed a bit more in regards to the actual reducing work output and force production, is there's a difference in the horizontal movement based off of how we are positioned. That arch was a bit more vertical, required a little bit less horizontal movement, which in sense would be reducing our actual work output, versus that closer grip and more horizontal movement was increasing my work output. Now, doesn't mean if you're doing a close grip that it's wrong. That may be leveraged best for you, but a topic we'll get to soon. Next up is maybe someone needs to work on where that bar is sitting in their hands, because we need that bar to sit over our center of gravity of that wrist and the elbow as much as possible. If that bar is too far forward, it's naturally pulling this way. If it's too far back, that's actually, it could be an issue, but we would prefer it to pull back, because what happens if it pulls back? It's pulling still in between our shoulders. Not necessarily best when it comes to force output. It could create issues there, but at least if it's behind, it's still within our center of mass. If it's forward, it might dump in front of us and not be able to maintain that anymore. So our wrist extension and that bar placement in the hand is very important to be able to manage that center of mass over the center of gravity of where we are during the range of motion to the bench press. And then lastly, shoulder and elbow cueing. So, an example, I'm going to be extreme. If someone was super elevated, it's going to be pretty hard to manage their center of mass, because you can see here, I'm going to run out of room for that shoulder range of motion very, very quick. The opposite could be true based on our grip width with where our elbows are. If we're doing a fairly close grip and I'm telling someone that they need to drive their elbows out super flared out, yet they have to touch way down here, you can see here, I'm losing that position of keeping that bar between my elbows and my shoulder. The opposite is true to an extent that if I'm very, very wide and I tell someone to tuck a lot, now I'm still maintaining my center of mass, but then other issues come forth, which we're going to talk about very, very soon in regards to force production and work output. So lastly, we have deadlift. So again, I'm going to talk about 3 possible technique interventions that I might use if someone is really struggling with maintaining their center of mass and gravity in the deadlift. First up is just general starting position and slack pull. A lot of what we do when we're trying to pull slack and create tension is using that bar to create an equal and opposite reaction to pull our foot into the floor. So we would be very conscious while doing that of our foot pressure. If we're doing that and we're pulling into our toes, guess what's going to happen? We're probably going to be forward of our center of mass when we start the movement. Second is, where's that bar located in your stance? If that bar is way out over your toes and forward of your midfoot, you can't, I'll see if you can see me here as much as possible. Likely what's going to happen, you're going to have to, one, likely squat down too much, and as soon as you go to lift, that bar is going to swing back at you. Your hips are going to rise before the bar can start really coming straight up. The opposite is true, is if the bar is way too far back, it's likely going to want to swing out, and it's going to want to get back to the center of mass. And usually what happens, just like I talked about with squat, is it's going to overswing because we're not going to be able to stop it directly where we want it to. The momentum is going to carry it past where we actually want that center of gravity to be. And then lastly, it goes back to starting position, but understanding how to hinge. Way too many lifters will want to squat down to the bar, which immediately is going to change their center of mass, because we have to have a certain requirement of knee to hip flexion on both the squat and the deadlift. And the deadlift requires a bit more hip flexion and a bit less knee flexion. So we want to understand how to hinge, because if we don't, either one, we're likely going to drive our knees too far forward and turn it into a squat, or two, we're going to have our hips way too close to the bar. And so therefore it's going to want to, in a sense, either one, overly round our back, which again, rounding your back is not incorrect necessarily. We'll talk about that during the range section, but it could be more to the point where it's affecting your impact to create force output, and or it could be affecting your ability to maintain your center of mass, because either one, it's going to overly round, or two, it's going to straighten out and the bar is going to swing forward on you. So getting into our last factor, we've got good technique is aimed to decrease work output and increase force production. And of the 3 factors, this is definitely the hardest to quantify and be objective about. Powerlifting rules is pretty darn objective. When it comes to center of mass, lifters can be able to tend to feel that, engage that themselves, and through a watchful coach's eye, it's pretty easy to see when our center of mass is deviating. But when it comes to reducing work output, again, it goes back to the physics calculation. Likely no coach is ever actually going to calculate that, nor probably should. It's likely a waste of time. And more so, at least from a coaching perspective, it's more from just a watchful eye and experience that you're able to generally gauge if someone has, in a sense, unneeded movement that is adding to their work output that we could eliminate in some way. Force output, on the other hand, even though we aren't going to necessarily calculate it, we can see a more objective measure of weight lifted. I mean, that is our goal in powerlifting, to lift the most weight possible. So our goal is to be able to create technical patterns that allow us to express strength to its full degree. And within work output and force production, and being able to somehow quantify this, this is the one where probably elite level lifters get the most questions on, and why you see them doing things that look outside of the norm, yet works for them in some manner based on their leverages. That is maximizing what works best for them to reduce work output and increase force production. Does it look like every lifter? No, but again, we can't see every factor that goes into it. A lot of things just come down to individual leverages and what feels best per person. So if we're not going to calculate work output, what do I mean by this? As I've somewhat said already, it's about eliminating unneeded movement, As well as we also have primary muscle groups that most people listening know are involved in each lift. And we want those primary muscles to be doing their job. It's the reason why we don't good morning a squat, because we understand that the quadriceps are very important as well. It's the reason we don't squat our deadlift, because we realize that the hamstrings, glutes, and lower back are very important. There's so many factors that go into this, but it's also very individual for each lifter on mechanically how they leverage the best to be the strongest. And so that's where the incorrect definition of good technique, that one size fits all, does not work, and where good technique and saying good technique gets a bad rap. If we use a bottoms-up approach, though, that should be guiding lifters to what works best for them versus forcing them into a hole that they don't fit into because of a top-down approach. And maybe to further understand decreasing work output and increasing force production, an extreme example is, I think everyone watching this could agree that if we are barbell squatting, it is best to squat on 2 legs, not just 1 leg. Now, it's within the rules that we have to keep both feet on the floor, but you wouldn't recommend anyone overly shift their entire center of mass over onto one side and just squat on their right leg. We would understand that that would be a very inefficient way to squat. Now, does it mean a slight hip shift is wrong? No, that may be biasing into the hip mechanics of someone. So a slight deviation could very well be within the range of what is strongest for a particular lifter. And the same can apply too when we're looking at someone like Sean Noriega and his bench press versus Ashton when he does his close grip bench press. We can see a very obvious difference in range of motion. It doesn't even mean either or is wrong. It doesn't mean Ashton needs to get a super high arch bench and go wider, and it doesn't mean Sean that his bench needs to in sense change because he's only doing 2-inch range of motion and it's cheating. Within how they are built and how they are leveraged mechanically, that is how they feel the strongest. Even though their work output is different, since the distance traveled is different, there is a difference in how they're able to produce force in those two positions, and Ashton feels really strong in his position, and Sean feels really strong in his position. And as I alluded to in the center of mass discussion, a lot of that topic leaks into this discussion, because a lot of what a lifter is doing is finding ways to best maintain their center of mass within how they're built and what feels best to produce the highest force output possible. There's a lot of carryover here. And again, you could almost leave this point out and the video would have done its job, but the fact of the matter is I don't think we can talk about good technique without talking about the fact that we are trying to decrease work output and increase force output. That is what we are trying to do in regards to strength. It's just, we can't necessarily quantify it with a top-down approach because every lifter is different. It's more so thinking bottoms-up approach of here's what we're trying to accomplish within powerlifting rules, within maintaining our center of mass, and within decreasing work output and increasing force output for each individual lifter. And if we can satisfy those 3 for a lifter individually, we can quantify that and sense or define it as good technique. We can somewhat define this though for squat, bench, and deadlift. So again, following just in the pattern we did for the other lifts, let's look at what does it mean to decrease work output and increase force output for the squat, bench, and deadlift. So for the squat and deadlift, it's the exact same. Reducing work output occurs by moving the bar in a straight up and down line over our center of mass in the shortest distance possible that is best suited for the lifter's leverages. So can we have deviation from this? Yes, and we're going to get to that very soon. And I say what's best suited for lifters' leverages because again, using Sean versus Ashton does not have a super high arch. He literally cannot do that likely genetically. So he has found a way to maximize within his range of motion and his leverages how to reduce work output. Now, I think if you told Ashton he should go even more flat back, he likely would tell you he feels weaker that way. Or if you're even going a closer grip or changing grip, whatever it may be, he may say, I feel weaker that way. He has found within his leverages what feels the best in the shortest distance traveled possible. And with increasing force output, what that means is having the joints in line as much as possible to allow as much passive stability as we can. What passive stability means is that the bones are supporting some of the weight, not just the muscles. In a sense, we want to stack the weight as much as possible for the bones to passively support the weight, because then the muscles have to do less work, which this comes back a lot to just maintaining your center of mass. If we do that, we tend to stack it as best as possible. The more we deviate from that, the more we have to have active stabilization to bring that load back to our center of gravity. For bench press, increasing force output's the exact same thing. We're trying to maintain our center of mass and having as much passive stabilization as possible to reduce the amount of work the muscles and sense have to do. With reducing work output though, there is one more caveat, because even though all three lifts were fighting against a vertical gravitational pull, within the bench press, we also have some horizontal movement, which varies based off of lifter position and grip width and a lot of other factors. So some lifters are going to have more horizontal movement, meaning they're going to touch lower on their body, but either way, they're going to end back up over their shoulders. They're going to start over their shoulders, touch at some point, end over their shoulders. Depending on position, that's going to change. Likely someone with a really high arch and really wide grip is going to touch higher and have a more vertical press. Someone who's more close grip and flat back is going to have a little bit more horizontal movement. It's not wrong if you have more horizontal movement, but the caveat to bench is we still, within the lifter's leverages and what they bias towards, they want to limit horizontal movement as much as possible. There may be more than some other lifters, but they do not want to add unneeded horizontal movement. So now that we have a bit more understanding of what defines decreasing work output and increasing force output in the squat, bench, and deadlift, we're going to look at this now from a bottoms-up approach, but from a little bit of a different perspective than we did for the first two factors. The reason being is this factor is the most individual to the lifter and most individual to the coach's beliefs, biases, and systems. There are many ways that people may decrease work output and increase force output, whether the lifter is finding individually that is what works best for them, or two, the coach has a system of technique and biomechanics that may differ from other coaches that they found really works within their system. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong as long as they are accomplishing the tasks. And as I've already said, this is where things get muddied the most of people arguing what is good technique. And that tends to come up though because of a top-down approach. All of us likely agree we want to decrease work output and increase force output, but how we get there differs. But what we do agree on, and most likely agree for the most part, is to increase force output and decrease work output. We want to maintain our center of mass as best as possible, which is why I said the carryover between these two factors is very high. The next up, and the single biggest thing for each individual lifter, is what feels best for them. Some might do a wider stance on squat, some might be narrower, some might be wider on bench, some might be narrower, some might sumo deadlift, some might conventional. There's a large spectrum of what feels best for the lifter. So what we're trying to do within our systems in a bottoms-up approach is be able to find for that lifter what is best for them to accomplish this task. And then bringing that all together, as I've said multiple times through this video, it comes back to a range. There is likely a range where there's not much performance impact. Then we slightly deviate more and we see a little bit of performance impact. And then we deviate a lot and we see to where people can't even perform the movements correctly. And we're calling that, in a sense, bad technique, and the end of the spectrum where they can't be able to buy within powerlifting rules. They are falling backwards or forwards and not able to maintain their center of mass, and therefore they are making a lot more work for themselves and not having the ability to express strength and have maximal force output. So that brings us to our last point, which is good technique is a range. And this is where we're going to have the coach of coaches, Brad Couillard, come in and be able to really break this down for you. And to give a little bit of an introduction and repeat some of the things I've already said, is inherently, if there is bad technique, and I agree in some manner we can agree there's bad technique, there must be good technique. And then if you agree there's good technique, because we assume that there's a reason why we give technical interventions because we think things can be better or good, then there must be bad. So there has to be a spectrum here. And our goal is to hopefully define this in a way that at least gives a framework. We can never be perfectly objective, but we can give a framework from a bottoms-up approach of how we can combat this to be able to give a better definition of what is good technique and what is bad technique. All right, so that wraps it up. Big thank you for Brad for wanting to be a part of this. As I said, me and him have literally been going back and forth for, I think, over 6 months kind of talking about this topic. And I've changed a lot of what I originally had because it needed to be, in a sense, as simple as possible, because that is what is the framework of technique. When we're doing the bottoms up approach, we're looking at, do we meet the rules of powerlifting? Are we able to maintain our center of mass? And are we decreasing work output and increasing force output? Everything comes down to that in some manner. And if we're working from those bottoms up factors and then creating technique interventions and in sense improvements or whatever we may do there to accomplish those tasks, we're likely headed in the right direction. It's the issue of people saying that there is one way is the highway, or thinking everyone should do the exact same thing without realizing there are so many factors that are going to go into each individual lifter and what truly matters in a sense when it comes to technique and what we're trying to accomplish, in particular in the sport of powerlifting.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate being a part of this. So without further ado, I'll jump right into it. So good technique is going to be on this range, and I'll kind of start defining that. Basically, it's an abstract range of good technique versus quote unquote bad technique. We'll dive deeper into how that relates to specific aspects, whether it's in a lift. But for all intents and purposes, what we're talking about is the three aspects that Steve has already mentioned regarding competition standard, the balance and the efficiency, right? And so those three items together would, solidifies the idea of what good technique is and this true standard that we're looking for. And so that would be like the middle point or the middle point of the spectrum. And as we work out, we start to see a different combinations of those three, some more than others. And as we work further and further away from that middle point, we don't have any of them. And that is where you would look in terms of, helping an athlete try to kind of find the middle again. And, you can have an athlete that has the competition standard down, but their efficiency might be off, their balance might be off. And we see that, right? Like deadlift doesn't have a very specific competition standard other than lift the bar off the floor and be upright at the top. There can be a lot that happens in between, and some things are going to be less efficient than others, right? And there's going to be balance shifts that are not efficient either. So in that regard, right, we're kind of basically working to try to stay in the middle, and then if it floats in or out, we're still within that range that we're looking for. So now that we've talked about what good technique is and the range it exists on, let's talk about what that range concept is based on, and that's based on the concept of movement variability. Movement variability is the notion that not every repetition we perform is going to be identical. So that means if we take a 3-rep set, those 3 reps are going to be slightly different. But fundamentally, those 3 reps are going to fall within that good technique range. And so these micro adjustments or micro nuances between these 3 reps are not a big concern unless that variability is outside of that technique range. And so we really only want to focus on the lifter and the ability to create a simplistic approach to each lift, because that variability is always going to exist. If we try to chase that variability to try to center it, we're trying to basically create this perfect technique that doesn't exist. We have to have that movement variability because, one, that creates allows our system to learn and adapt those nuances and be able to organize itself and still execute the task. And when we, in a future competition, and I've been shifting a little bit here and there in training, I want to be able to be prepared to do that on the platform as well. So what happens when our technique is not within this range or it's fallen out of range? We need to look at making an intervention, and interventions should be less is more approach. We want to have minimal cueing, minimal adjustments, because we need the subconscious patterns to develop. We need the variability to help get us there, and we need the self-confidence as well. And when our conscious focus is too high, we're going to feel very clunky and out of rhythm. We need to be able to help take those appropriate steps along that spectrum to get closer to where we want to be. And that's a learning process. Just like any technique, it's always going to have a little bit of that variability where it's going to maybe feel like it's making progress and maybe taking a step back. And it's going to develop until things become a lot more comfortable, and the minimal cueing, the subconscious, and the self-confidence all work together to help us get there. To kind of summarize what we're talking about here, right? We have this overarching range, or this overarching idea of what good technique is and how it exists on a spectrum. And within that, each lift is going to have different aspects that have its own range, whether it's specifics like flexion or extension, anterior pelvic tilt versus posterior pelvic tilt, things like that, that we're also going to have ranges for. And again, just like the good technique spectrum, we're always going to have a little bit of variability and still be able to achieve the good technique and check those 3 boxes that we're looking for. And that can exist for every individual, and that can be based on a variety of factors, from psychological to physiological to environmental, what have you, that is going to induce that variability. And again, that variability is extremely helpful for us, to be able to learn and adapt to these this pattern that are going to have all these iterations mixed into it. So for the squat, right, fundamentally we are trying to get bar on the midfoot for the most part, and so we're going to see slight deviations from that. A lot of times we see that from the setup, or just as we move down through the pattern and how we manage our center of mass overall. And so when we see a bar that tends to kind of hover over that midfoot, maybe dance behind it, in front of it, what have you, that's fine, right? That is normal. That is a normal within our range. When we see it be a bit more egregious is where we kind of slide back into heels and that bar is on the heel, and then we start to kind of come forward. Those are things that we're going to want to typically address to help us kind of hone back in to see less deviation across that. Then you have lifters that have a really good squat pattern, but it just might be biased kind of hard on the heel or a little bit too forward, in which case we might just want to work on just kind of centering that balance to find that midfoot position again. But that is, variability is always going to exist. That's going to happen with heavier weights. You see some lifters that may tend to get really, really tight in anticipation of a heavy weight, which can kind of change their rhythm or flow of a pattern. But overall, they want to approach that lift with that same consistency as much as they can from warm-ups to top end, and then let that variability in that body kind of develop its attention into the bar to complete the task, essentially. Because if we try to over control or try to narrow down that variability like we talked about for that perfect technique, it typically gets us in trouble and makes movement in general a little clunky and uncomfortable. So for the bench press, some of the aspects that we see this variability exist in, especially as we get into heavier weights, because that's what we're going to talk about mostly. Because look, as we get stronger, we're going to have a lot more consistency from rep to rep, albeit there will be variability. That consistency from rep to rep at the lighter loads is not as distinguishable, and obviously as we get heavier, that's where we start to see things. So things like this in the bench press, we see it from maybe an elbow path position to maybe a touch point position, as well as an arch position as well. Now obviously there's environmental factors like carpet and pauses and things like that we see in competition, but for the most part, some of the deviations I'll show you here in a second. So one of the things that we see as we get into the heavier weights, right, is and even into depending on the individual and how they process the movement, is we see a little bit of elbow deviations where the elbows kind of tuck and maybe flare back out. And this is totally fine as long as things are checking the boxes in terms of efficiency and force output. So if we see those elbows kind of dump out, right, that's going to be okay. If you start to see egregious movements and things like that, that might be something we want to address. But again, it's all on a case-by-case basis for each individual and how they, how they execute. The other two, in terms of like as we get heavier, we may see is maybe even like a touch point control where I might kind of drop a little bit on the lower side compared to where I normally touch. Right, so I can come down and kind of
lose that position a little bit at the bottom, and that's totally fine. And it's just about trying to recover and being able to still generate that force. The other one too is as we get heavier that we sometimes see is where we'll be able to leverage that arch, and as we press we see that rib cage drop a little bit as we try to press away. And so those are some of the examples that we may see, whether again as maybe as fatigue starts to set in, or we're waiting for a pause command, what have you. Those are all different factors that we'll experience and things that you may see, and they're not a cause for concern because it's relatively normal to have those little bit of deviations because we're still meeting the standard of what we're looking for. So to kind of talk about the deadlift and some of the variability that we see, not too many other than related to mostly center of mass issues, and then a lot of times just spinal positions, right? We're going to see lifters maybe shift back into their heels and try to drop their hips and pull that weight up. Again, not a big concern as long as it's not too egregious and is not reducing our ability to create an efficient force production. So that's one issue. Typically, we would see it from the hips being a little on the lower side or being a bit more too upright and trying to pull upward in that manner where we don't have enough full foot pressure to the floor. The other thing that we tend to see is spinal flexion or extension. And when we get really heavy, you're going to see a lot of individuals tend to give a little bit in that upper back, for a conventional standpoint, or for a sumo, where you're going to see that back give, and we're going to kind of be locking through like that. And so that variability is completely normal. It's when things are becoming a bit too pronounced that it might be kind of inefficient for that lifter to be able to generate force, and that might be something we want to address.
So thank you to everyone who tuned in for this. I've definitely got some links below to some videos that I kind of mentioned, as well as I'll link Brad's information if you want to reach out to him for coaching or any more questions. But otherwise, if you have any questions as well in this video, make sure to comment down below. Make sure to share it, pass this along. I mean, this was a video I really wanted to make because I hope that this helps to bring coaches who are in sense against each other because of differing views together, realizing that we're all trying to accomplish the same task. And I'd like for this to be something that can grow for people to understand that this is the base of what is good technique, and we can all have a better understanding of what is a bottoms-up approach, and that's really going to help to be able to kind of consolidate and clarify why each person is doing what they're doing. So if you haven't already, make sure to hit the subscribe button, give it a like so this video does better on the algorithm, and otherwise I will talk to you all later. Peace.